Welcome everybody. I'm Arnaud Lefranc. I'm the director of CY Advanced Studies. It's a special pleasure in a way. It's also a very special occasion to welcome you to this first e-lecture of the Institute of Advanced Studies, which is the current times adaptation of our seminar, which is meant to foster interdisciplinary exchange as part of the Institute of Advanced Studies activities. So for those who are new to the guest lectures are delivered by visitors to the IAS, especially the fellows in residence of CY Advanced Studies. Today we have the pleasure to have Robert Lustig speaking from California, actually, because as you can probably guess, the activities of the IAS are largely compromised by the current pandemic crisis. But this e-guest lecture is the proof that we're trying to adapt and not let the pandemic crisis put us off from interacting, exchanging scientific ideas and conducting our activities. So today's speaker is Robert Lustig. Robert is a professor of pediatrics at the University of California, San Francisco. He's also a member, amongst other things, of the Institute for Health Policy Studies at UCSF. Robert's field of expertise is neuroendocrinology, and his research has largely dealt with issues pertaining to nutrition and metabolism, as well as aspects of addiction. And his current project at the IAS during his fellowship in residence involves the modeling of addictive behavior and the neurological aspects of addictive behavior. And this is a research conducted in partnership with Philippe Bossier, who's a specialist of neurorobotics at the Research Center, and their collaboration is meant to develop a model of neural functioning. Today, Robert is going to tell us all the secret to wellness, which is a very important topic in general, and especially relevant in the current conditions that we are all going through. The lecture of Robert Lustig is scheduled to last for about an hour. Of course, it's going to be a bit difficult to interact in the way we typically do it during our lectures. What I suggest is that the discussion takes place essentially at the end of the lecture. We can have a round of questions and reactions to the talk. But during the talk, what I will kindly ask you to do is to turn off your video and mute your microphone. You have a little button at the bottom left of your screen to mute yourselves and stop the video, and this will probably save a little bit of data exchange between us and the cloud circle. So Robert, thanks a lot for accepting to somehow inaugurate this new format of the guest lectures, and the floor is yours for about an hour. Thanks a lot, Rob.
Thank you, Arnaud, and thank you all for attending. Unfortunately, you are now all muted. Normally, I like to poll the audience and ask questions.
Hello.
But
Hi, Robert.
Sorry. Hi, Flora. Sorry.
Glad to meet you.
no problem. Normally, if I poll the audience, I have questions to ask, and that way we are all on the same page. So I'm going to have to adapt a little bit. So the first question, just for your own, and put in your own mind, is, am I wearing underwear as I give this talk? That is the first question. Now that we are all at home. The second question is, you go up into your attic and you find a wasp. What do you do? Do you kill the wasp, or do you find the wasp's nest? In order to be successful in terms of any meaningful therapeutics, you have to work upstream of the problem. And what I will be explaining as we go through this talk is that we have been working downstream of the problem, so it should be no surprise that the problem continues to only get worse. And that is the secret to wellness, is you have to work upstream of the problem. So with that, let me launch into the talk. First of all, I want to thank IEA/IAS for sponsoring my time in Paris. It was cut short because of the virus, but we are still working, and you'll see some of the output of that in a few minutes. In addition, my colleagues at CRI, the Center for Research in Interdisciplinarity in Paris, same, and the Fulbright Commission for sponsoring some of this work, and also my colleagues at the Center for Humane Technology in San Francisco, who are trying to basically bring the internet to heal. Good luck to us. So I have a very modest agenda today. I hope to be able to solve the healthcare crisis, solve the Social Security crisis, solve the opioid crisis, solve the depression crisis, and finally make America at least happy again, hopefully France too. That's all, just a very, very modest agenda. So let's start with the healthcare crisis. This is a paper that came out in 2001 based on 2000 data from Nature about the number and prevalence of type 2 diabetics on the planet at the time. And you'll notice here at 2000 we had 151 million diabetics. What was projected for the next decade would be an increase to 221 million, which would be a 46% increase, or an annualized inflation rate of 3.88%. This is not what we saw. In fact, what we saw was 285 million diabetics and an annualized inflation rate of 6.55%, a doubling in prevalence over what we had expected to see. And then over the next 4 years, we saw an increase to 422 million for an annualized inflation rate of 10.3%, a tripling. All right, can I? Someone talking? I'm sorry.
Hi everybody, let me remind you of the ticket, this online guest lecture. We agreed that questions would be asked at the end of the talk. If there's a pressing request for clarification, you can use the chat option of the Zoom meeting to ask the questions online, and we'll share them with Robert as he makes his presentation.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that again. I know. All right, so where were we? Ultimately, 10.3%. And the question is, what in the world is going on? It seems that actually doctors cause diabetes, because as we've been watching this, as we've been taking care of it, it's actually been increasing. And there's actually some truth to that concept. And I'll show you how. So if you look at the prevalence of heart disease, it has actually been decreasing over time here on the left. But what happened instead is that what's taken its place is diabetes at a much greater level, and is actually costing more because diabetes is a long-term chronic disease compared to heart disease, which tends to kill relatively quickly. So it is actually draining resources from healthcare systems around the world. And if you take a look at the numbers in terms of the economics, So here in red, we have hospital costs. In green, we have physician costs, and here in purple, pharma costs. They do not add up to the total healthcare costs. And the reason is because the rest is going to the care and treatment of chronic metabolic disease, such as diabetes. And of course, nobody is interested in making any meaningful lifestyle changes. They're all interested in the pill, because that's our, society at the present time is, give me the pill. And the point is that when you actually look at the data, when you look at the cofactors, the co-repressors for these chronic metabolic diseases, none of them are druggable. They're all foodable, but they're not druggable. And so we have not seen any improvement. We have only seen a worsening because we have not been dealing with the problem. We have been dealing downstream of the problem instead of upstream. This also reflects on Social Security. Now, you're all familiar with the concept of Social Security. As you probably know, it's a Ponzi scheme because the young, healthy people have to pay in so that the old, infirm people at the top can take out. But what if the young, healthy people are not healthy? What if they're actually infirm? What if they're on disability? What if they're on dialysis? The entire pyramid collapses. And that's why here in the United States, Social Security will be broke by the year 2034. And you can see that for Medicaid, this is for Social Security, I apologize. You can see the fall off here in 2029 that will occur because we will have a Social Security fund that will be completely depleted because people cannot pay in at the bottom part of the pyramid. This is now also being reflected in changes in life expectancy, and you may have heard about this, but we've now had 4 years in a row of decreasing life expectancy here in the United States. So here's the OECD aggregate continuing to increase. Other countries are doing much better than us. And we have stabilized out and actually have seen a decline by 0.1 years each year for the last 4 years. If you take a look here, here's the USA here in red, and you'll notice here's the plateau and the start of the decline here on the right. And here are all the other countries, including developing countries down here, that are all actually catching up to us. So we in the United States are particularly behind the 8 ball in terms of this. When you compare life expectancy to health expenditure, you would expect that the more you spend on health, the longer the life expectancy would be the case. Now, that is clearly not true for most countries. There's France in the red circle there. You're sort of in the middle of the pack for the OECD countries. But take a look here at the United States. I mean, we have clearly lost our way, and it has been going on really since 1970. Now, if we're all dying, the question is, what are we dying of? So here we have death rates, and you'll notice here, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, Sweden, over time, that's 100,000 have actually been declining. And interestingly, U.S. Hispanics have been declining, but take a look at U.S. whites here in red. Clearly something going on. And if you look at what they are dying of, it is poisonings, lung cancer, suicides, chronic liver disease, and diabetes, the diseases of despair. And in fact, more people are dying of the diseases of despair now than anything else. Most of them are non-college grads, as you can see here, as opposed to college grads. But that's saying something about the causes of those. And this is a paper that came out in Nature just recently, looking at, without a bachelor's degree, this is a heat map of time going forward and the incidence based on age. And you'll notice that a lot of the people who are dying are the young people, not the old people, as opposed to those with a bachelor's degree where it's not nearly quite as bad. And in fact, Annie Case and Angus Deaton, Nobel Prize winner at Princeton, have published this book, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. And that is really what we are going to be talking about today, is how these two things relate to each other. If you take a look at mental health now instead of physical health, you'll notice depression and suicide are up all over the United States. And a lot of the cases, half the cases, were not even known to have a mental health problem before the suicide. If you look here at deaths from opioids, they're up. You look at deaths from cocaine, they're up. You look at deaths from benzos, and it's really hard to kill yourself with a benzo. You have to be trying really hard. They're up. So here are the deaths of despair, country by country. Here we are for non-Hispanic whites here in blue, as you can see. The UK is also having a significant problem. They have a 60% increase in deaths of despair in the UK. France, as you can see here in the gray, not quite as bad, and that's good. Germany also not quite as bad. But certainly in the United States and in the UK, this is a major problem. Here is the use of illicit drugs in the United States, and you can see that marijuana is up and other illicit drugs are up. Here we have illicit drugs in that 50 to 64-year-old age group. And this is particularly concerning because this is alcohol use and men versus women. And what you'll notice is that alcohol use is up in everybody, but take a look at the 83.7% increase in alcohol abuse disorder amongst women. And when you look at which women down below, the older, the more alcohol use. So this is not a young person's problem. This is an older person's problem. So older people are becoming more, are suffering more and more despair. But it's not just the older population. It's teen depression as well. We have children's hospital admissions with diagnosis of suicidal ideation. And you'll notice from the 12 to 14 and the 15 to 17-year-old age group, there's been a clear increase in annual visits to the emergency room with self-harm and also in outpatients. Here, 2008 to 2015, a tripling in the number of adolescents coming to clinic with expression of suicidal ideation or self-harm. So if you take a look at whether or not they are being successful, this is death rates here on the y-axis against year and the ages 10 to 14 here in the United States. And you'll notice that motor vehicle accidents have been halved because of crumple zones and car seats, etc. But what's taken its place instead now is suicide. There are more suicides now than motor vehicle accident deaths in the United States. This is an absolute disaster. And when you take a look at where the iPhone enters this, this is when the upswing started. So there's a very clear relationship between the advent of social media, and that's true also for the 15 to 19-year-old age group as well. Here's the advent of the iPhone and the increase in suicide death rates in all adolescents. Antidepressant use is up in the United States over this period of time as well. But it is not just an American phenomenon. It's going on all over the world. The World Health Organization now says that 4.4% of the entire world is clinically depressed. And this is not sampling error or bias, because that was controlled for. And in fact, there's been an almost 20% increase in prevalence over the decade of social media. So, to summarize, our metabolic health is going down the tubes, as evidenced by the diabetes pandemic. Our mental health is going down the tubes, as demonstrated by the depression and suicide pandemic. And our money is going down the tubes, as evidenced by Social Security and Medicare going broke. So, are these coincidence, or are they related? Are these occur in a vacuum, or are they somehow inextricably related to each other, and how? And what's the causation? The concept that metabolic and mental health might be related to each other is not a crazy one. It's been advocated and advanced by many people in the medical field. Here are 4 books that have been written about this issue. And in fact, there is an entire society devoted to this called the Integrative Medicine and Mental Health Conference. And I'm supposed to be the keynote speaker at this thing in August. in Chicago if it takes place, and that's yet to be determined. Just as an example of the interaction between metabolic and mental health, this is a pathway diagram of how insulin resistance here in the upper left, where the red arrow is, can ultimately lead to major depressive disorder and through the neurochemicals that are involved in that, so that there is a very clear relationship between these two. They do not exist in a vacuum. This paper looks at whether or not it's related to obesity. Now, we know that obesity is related to depression. We also know that obesity is related to cognitive dysfunction, which in this case was measured by reaction time to a specific stimulus. And you can see that there is a relationship, but there's actually a much better relationship to inflammation, as noted here by the log of interleukin-6. So when you look at the reaction time, you'd say, well, you know, clearly old versus young and high BMI versus low BMI certainly makes a difference. But when you actually do the multivariate linear regression analysis, turns out that it's the IL-6 that's the important factor, not the BMI. And the IL-6 is driving it. So inflammation is the driver of cognitive dysfunction in these patients. So again, metabolic health, mental health are clearly related. So the question is, how? Is it that metabolic health influences mental health, which influences healthcare dollars going in this direction on this circle? Or is it that metabolic health influences healthcare dollars, which influences mental health? Or do people enter on the mental health side? Where is the entry point? Because you will not be able to solve this problem unless you work upstream, which means you have to understand root cause. So this is sort of the important paradigm that I'm trying to address with this talk. Which of these comes first? Or could it be some other factor that's influencing all three at the same time? So that's where we're going with this talk. So, question: does being unhappy kill you? Does unhappiness contribute to mortality? Well, this was answered in the UK Million Women study that came out in 2016, and this is the data. I'm just going to read you from the abstract. Okay? There's no question that people who were unhappy died, but the question is why? Because after adjustment for self-rated health, treatment of hypertension, diabetes, asthma, arthritis, depression, or anxiety, and several socio-demographic and lifestyle factors, including smoking, deprivation, body mass index, unhappiness was not associated with mortality from all cause, from ischemic heart disease or from cancer. So it turns out that it's the things that we do when we're unhappy that kill us, not the unhappiness itself. This was also looked at in this paper, which was an economics paper, looking at happiness and longevity. And looking and saying, yes, unhappy people do die young, but it's not because of the unhappiness. So you hear this is measures of life satisfaction in Germany and in Australia, looking at hazard versus survival. And ultimately, and this is the comment of the authors, it remains our view, however, that many, perhaps all, of these additional controls could be consequences of life satisfaction, not just causes. This caveat applies particularly to variables measuring physical exercise, participation in social activities, smoking, and perhaps obesity. It is also likely that initial health, also included as a control in extended model 2, is a consequence as well as a cause of life satisfaction. In other words, the take-home from these two papers is that unhappiness itself doesn't kill. There are plenty of 100-year-old curmudgeons out there. Rather, it's what we do to get happy that kills. It's the pleasure, stupid. Let me show you how that works. So here are all of the things that drive dopamine, the pleasure, okay, in the reward system of the brain. Chemical stimuli like nicotine, alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and sugar, by the way, and we'll get to sugar in a moment, and behavioral. shopping, gambling, pornography, exercise, gaming. Each of these, and you would say exercise increases longevity, but actually, if you are addicted to exercise, it actually causes mortality. There is a limit to exercise, and you know that because of the exercise-induced amenorrhea, and those patients actually die earlier, in part because of their osteoporosis. And I think the biggest issue, and the one that pretty much everyone is exposed to because it's so cheap, is sugar. So listen to this.
Rob, we don't have the audio on this one. The sound is probably not shared between your computer and ours, so maybe we can skip that video or detail.
So that was Eric Clapton describing how he got into heroin, that sugar, in fact, for him was a gateway drug. And that's likely true for many people. In fact, that sugar addiction has led to a whole new disease known as non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which is now the leading cause of liver transplant in women in the United States. Okay? Alcohol used to be the cause of fatty liver disease. Now it's sugar. In addition, processed food correlates with depression. As you can see here, the hazard risk ratio continuing to go up based on ultra-processed food consumption. So what we're eating is making a major difference in terms of our mental health. And one of the reasons is because the sweet molecule in sugar, fructose, here on the left, has a very different effect on mitochondrial function than does glucose. Glucose activates mitochondria, activating AMP kinase, as you can see here, as opposed to fructose, which suppresses fatty acid oxidation and actually decreases beta oxidation in the mitochondria. So glucose activates this enzyme here, hexose dehydrogenase, whereas fructose inhibits ACAD-L, which is a long acyl-CoA dehydrogenase. Ron Kahn, the head of Joslin Diabetes Center, said about this study of his, the most important takeaway of this study is that high fructose in the diet is bad. It's not bad because it's more calories, but because it has effects on liver metabolism to make it worse at burning fat. As a result, adding fructose to the diet makes the liver store more fat, and this is bad for the liver and bad for whole body metabolism. Turns out it's also bad for brain metabolism because astrocytes have the same problem and end up not being able to make enough ATP, and astrocytes nourish neurons. Neurons don't do their own nourishment, astrocytes do it. And the effect of fructose on astrocyte ATP generation is also inhibited. So the more sugar, the more brain problems. In addition, we have behavioral addictions. Okay, and one of the reasons I came to Sergi and Cri was to develop a curriculum to combat technology addiction in children. And of course, not everybody believes in this. Some people think it's a myth. Let's take a look. So this is a paper that came out just 3 months ago trying to answer the question, is there such a thing as technology addiction? So I'm just going to, I've highlighted in yellow some of the important things that they were talking about. So first of all, it's narrative reviews and meta-analyses in large-scale pre-registered cohort studies. And they used longitudinal and ecological momentary assessment studies rather than raw data. A specific focus on depression and anxiety, not on addiction. They looked at correlational data, and it was focused on adults rather than adolescents. Whoops, sorry. And they ultimately report out small associations between the amount of daily digital technology usage and adolescents' well-being that do not offer a way of distinguishing cause from effect and are unlikely to be of clinical or practical significance. So you would read this paper and you would say, well, very clearly then there is no effect. But that is because of the nature of the types of papers that they use. One paper that actually looked at this question in a raw data and time-related fashion is this time lag analysis that was done demonstrating Facebook use in people who were already depressed. As you can see here, you can notice that they became more depressed. But it turned out that even people who were not depressed when they started using Facebook became more depressed after using Facebook. And from a life satisfaction standpoint, same thing. Not as strong an R value in the people who were not depressed to start with, but negative nonetheless and still significant. So it turns out everyone's more unhappy after using Facebook. And Facebook use correlates with addiction scores and neuroimaging in the nucleus accumbens, in the ventral striatum, as you can see here. So there's neuroimaging data and there's empiric demographic data that supports the notion that Facebook drives addiction. And the reason is because of this thing, the like button. Prior to the advent of the like button, which occurred in 2006, Facebook was only used cursorily by a few people. It was the like button that really drove engagement. And the reason is because it drives addiction. Perhaps this is the most interesting slide I'm going to show you today. This is a study that was done by my colleague Tristan Harris at the Center for Humane Technology. What are the happy apps here on the left versus the unhappy apps here on the right? And when you look at the happy apps, you'll notice that daily usage is relatively low. Now let's take a look at these happy apps. Calm, Google Calendar, Headspace, Insight Timer, Weather, MyFitnessPal, Audible, Waze, Amazon Music, Podcast, Kindle, Evernote, Spotify, Weather, and Canvas. These 15 happy apps all have one thing in common. They're all one-way apps. The information goes from the app to the user and stays there. Now let's look at the unhappy apps. Grindr, Candy Crush Saga, Facebook, WeChat, Candy Crush, Reddit, Tweetbot, Weibo, Tinder, Subway Surf, 2Dots, Instagram, Snapchat, 1010, and Clash Royale. Notice, user engagement is much higher, yet they are unhappy. So why would users use them more if it made them unhappy? And the answer is because they're addictive. So what do these 15 apps have in common? They're all two-way apps. They're all social media apps. The information goes from the app to the user, back to the app, then to a second user, and then back to the app. And it is through that social media aspect that drives the stress, the cortisol, as well as the dopamine that ultimately leads to the addiction. And it is dopamine and cortisol together that drives addiction. And I will show you in a moment how that might be. In France, you do know this because they have taken cell phones away from high school students while they're in the school, very specifically because they know that they are addictive. So what I would propose to you is that the reason that this has happened in our society, both from a metabolic and mental health standpoint, is that we have been hacked. And the hack is the systematic confusion and conflation of two words, two terms that people have now assumed to mean the same thing, pleasure and happiness. So what is the difference between the two? Well, there are 7 that I can count. Number 1, pleasure is short-lived, like a meal. Happiness is long-lived, like a lifetime. Happiness is visceral. You feel it in your body. It has a systemic component. Happiness is ethereal, that you feel it above the neck. Pleasure is taking, like from a casino. Happiness is giving, like to Habitat for Humanity. Pleasure is experienced alone. Happiness is usually experienced in social groups. Pleasure is achievable with substances, cocaine, heroin, nicotine. Happiness is not achievable with substances. The extremes of pleasure, whether it be substances or behaviors, all lead to addiction. So every one of those aholics, okay, that's because of dopamine, because ultimately dopamine over stimulation is the driver of the phenomenon of addiction. And I'll show you how in a moment. Whereas you can't be addicted to too much happiness. And lastly, number 7, pleasure is dopamine and happiness is serotonin. two different neurotransmitters, two different areas of the brain, two different sets of receptors, two different mechanisms of action. These are not the same. And of course, our ancestors knew that they were not the same. And in olden days, pleasure was hard to come by. Now it's cheap. So here's the dopamine or pleasure pathway in the brain. Starts here in the midbrain at the ventral tegmental area, which is the site of the dopamine paracarrier. They then project onto the nucleus accumbens, which is where the dopamine D1 and D2 receptors are localized. And they also project over to the prefrontal cortex, which is a very important part of this story. The prefrontal cortex is, in essence, the damper on this dopamine pathway to keep it from going hog wild. Here's the happiness or contentment or serotonin pathway. Notice a different nucleus in the midbrain, the dorsal raphe, instead of the ventral tegmental area. So they come from different places. And it bathes the entire brain, including the prefrontal cortex. And then finally, the last pathway is the stress-fear memory pathway. And you'll notice the prefrontal cortex inhibits the amygdala. The amygdala is the fear center. Hippocampus is the memory center. These two are in reciprocity with each other. So when the fear center gets turned on, two things happen. The hippocampus tries to calm the amygdala by saying, I've seen this before. And the prefrontal cortex calms it down by saying, there doesn't seem to be any danger. But ultimately, if the amygdala is allowed to be unfettered, the hypothalamus is in connection, and it will end up releasing the stress hormone cortisol. And it is cortisol that changes the synaptogenesis in the brain and the neurometabolics of the brain that ultimately lead to the phenomenon of addiction. And it has to do with whether or not the prefrontal cortex is working or not in order to keep the amygdala suppressed. So you'll notice that the prefrontal cortex is a relatively recent invention ontogenically from a phylogenetic and ontogenic standpoint. So here it is in man, taking up 2/3 of the frontal lobe. As you go downward in species and genus, you'll notice that our forebears had way smaller prefrontal cortices than we did. Prefrontal cortex is pretty darn important. It's the thing that helps you predict the future. It is the brain's brake. When it breaks the nucleus accumbens, you can modulate addiction. When it breaks the dorsal raphe nucleus, you can modulate depression. When it breaks the amygdala, you can modulate anxiety. When it breaks the associative cortex, you can modulate inattention. And when you break the insula, you can modulate hate. And all 5 of these have been going up over the last 50 years. Do you really think there are 5 different problems in the brain? No, there's one problem in the brain, and it's the prefrontal cortex. And the reason is because of cortisol. And you can actually see this on MRI. So you can notice that, for instance, in obese people, the prefrontal cortex shows changes in thickness. Okay, and it's specific to the prefrontal cortex. And also changes in executive function in those patients as well. So this is a common phenomenon to obesity, to stress, and to changes in inattention, all changing prefrontal cortical thickness. So we put together a model based on all of this information that I espouse in the book that I wrote back in 2017. Here are the 5 things that have happened to our society over the past 50 years that contribute to metabolic and mental health decline. Technology, processed food, sugar, sleep deprivation, and drugs. Now, each of these stimulates dopamine. And dopamine downregulates its own receptor. Ligands downregulate their own receptor. What this means is more and more gives you less and less. This is the law of diminishing returns. In pharmacologic terms, this is the phenomenon of tolerance right here. Then throw some stress on top with cortisol to deactivate the prefrontal cortex. And now you've got a hog-wild nucleus accumbens, and that's what leads to addiction. So it is the combination of dopamine plus stress that leads to addiction. On the other side, we have these 5 things, all contributing to metabolic syndrome like diabetes. Well, all of those decrease serotonin, in part because of tryptophan, because of changes in tryptophan metabolism in the liver and in the brain. So you have less substrate. And stress, cortisol, decreases the receptor for serotonin, the 1A receptor. So now you have less ligand, fewer receptors, and that's what leads to depression. So that addiction and depression ultimately are two sides of the same coin, two separate systems, but being driven by the same 5 phenomena and the advent of stress. And so it is this stress component that is potentially under our control. These 5 things up here tend to be, to some extent, out of our control. When I decided to come to Cergy and Cré for the sabbatical, I started working with Philippe Gossier. And Philippe works in the robotics unit, and he had published this paper in 2017 on a robotics mechanism for metacognition. And so this was in the literature in PLOS ONE. And I took a look at this model of his, and I said, wait a second, this looks very familiar. I think I know this model. And I said, wait, how about if we did this instead? It's a neurobiological model. The robotics model and the neurobiological model. And so Philippe and I started working on what are we going to do to try to answer this question. And right now, this is our work product that we are still working on. We are not quite done. And what we have done is we have hooked up the different aspects, and we have been trying to model the specific areas of the brain in terms of signaling. And I unfortunately can't show you the circuitry, but we've actually developed a set of circuits that we can test in terms of the input to from each of these areas in an attempt to try to mitigate the effects on reward here at the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. So we are trying to determine what the inputs are that could ultimately help mitigate the effect of technology addiction and hopefully chemical addiction on adolescents. That's the goal. So here we are, the confusion of pleasure with happiness. How did this happen? This didn't used to be the case. How did we get hacked? And who did it? And over what period of time? Starts here. Starts with Aristotle. So Aristotle famously stated, the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain is a first principle. It is for the sake of this that we do all that we do. That sounds about right, and I think we also sort of agree with that. But then, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, along came a guy with Asperger's syndrome who didn't know the difference between pleasure and happiness. And his name was Jeremy Bentham. He happened to be the founder of University College London, and there is a statue of Jeremy Bentham in the center of UCL. And this is something Jeremy said. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of 2 sovereign masters, pain and pleasure, benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, all of which ultimately comes to the same thing. Bentham actually attempted to quantify happiness with a scale. Unfortunately, by conflating and confusing pleasure with happiness, came up with a scale that said money was a major contributor. This ended up being used by the German stock market in terms of their initial rules for the German stock market, which was adopted by the American stock market in the late 1800s. So through this concept of conflating pleasure and happiness, we ended up with a lot of economic problems. This was ultimately codified by this concept here, which was invented in 1929 at the time of the Great Depression by a gentleman by the name of Simon Kuznets, called Gross Domestic Product, GDP, and you're all familiar with the concept. But Kuznets actually did not think that this was such a good idea to measure national welfare, and said so. The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. Well, let's take a look at this concept of GDP. So here's the formula. Consumption plus government plus investment plus exports minus imports. So this is how you measure GDP. The problem is that GDP can be artificially inflated to make it look better. Since it's being used to measure economic benefits to specific countries, there is an impetus for any country to inflate its numbers, and they can do it through several mechanisms. They can do it through economic bailouts, like what happened in 2008, even like what's happening now with the stimulus due to coronavirus. You lower interest rates. Right now, interest rates are negative. So that will boost GDP. That doesn't mean people are happier or healthier, as we currently know. It doesn't take into account environmental pollution or technology, which actually, so you increase GDP by hurting the planet. It can't assess sustainability, car sales, say, versus exhaust or accidents. And here's the most important one for me. GDP equals food plus pharma. So the food industry goes up and the pharma industry goes up, therefore GDP goes up. But health is minus pharma. The least pharmaceuticals will ultimately confer the most health. So clearly GDP does not do right by this concept of metabolic and mental health. Ultimately, GDP is what turned us from individuals to consumers. And I'm not the only one who thinks GDP is a problem. Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winner, said in The Guardian, it's time to retire metrics like GDP because they don't measure the things that matter. And Iceland has actually now said that GDP is a problem. And Bhutan, of course, it uses gross national happiness as opposed to gross domestic product in terms of its social progress. So here's what happened. Okay, in what's gone on since. So everybody's familiar with John Maynard Keynes, and Jeremy and I had a very nice discussion about Keynes not too long ago. This is a statement that Keynes made in 1930. When the accumulation of wealth is no longer of high social importance, there will be great changes in the code of morals. The love of money as a possession, as distinguished from the love of money as a means to the enjoyments and realities of life, will be recognized for what it is, a somewhat disgusting morbidity, one of those semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensities in which one hands over the shutter to the specialist in mental disease. All I can say is, just look at the White House. I think Keynes would have, he'd be turning in his grave. But then something happened in the 1960s. This guy came on the scene, Milton Friedman, and he said something entirely opposite. What Milton Friedman said in the New York Times in 1970 is relevant. He said, what does it mean to say that business has responsibilities? Only people can have responsibilities. A corporation is an artificial person, and in this sense may have artificial responsibilities. But business as a whole cannot be said to have responsibilities. A corporate executive is an employee of the owners of the business. He has direct responsibility to his employers. That responsibility is to conduct the business in accordance with their desires, which generally will be to make as much money as possible. And as you know, we have basically abdicated this notion of social good for profit over the course of the last 50 years, in part because of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics. And we are now where we are. And we have seen Citizens United in the United States, which basically said corporations are people. Even Friedman didn't say they were people. He said they were artificial people. Now they're people because they have rights. So I would argue that this has in part been industry-driven and government-sanctioned. It's been willful and well-orchestrated. I'm not suggesting it's a conspiracy because there's no obvious collusion between industry actors, but it is a plot in order to increase market share because it's been engineered with a profit motive. This is my favorite Dilbert. I think you have Dilbert in France. But as you know, that's the boss on the left there on the exam table. The MRI shows your brain has been hijacked by dopamine pirates. You are now under the full control of social media corporations, gambling casinos, and big pharma. Are you writing me a prescription? No, I'm buying stock in those companies. And that's exactly what has happened to all of us. And here's an example. So here's the confusion of pleasure with happiness. So what's in that bottle? Caffeine, dopamine. Sugar, dopamine. Phosphoric acid, caramel coloring, carbonated water. Salt, no happiness. Pleasure, no happiness. How about the happy meal? Not so happy. The good news is that fewer happy meals are being sold. The bad news is kids are ordering off the dollar menu instead. How about happy hour? It's 5 o'clock somewhere. You know where it's 5 o'clock every day? 5 o'clock at 10 o'clock in the morning on NBC here in the United States, where Hoda and Kathy Lee drink on camera in the Today Show happy hour. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why we have an epidemic of alcohol abuse disorder amongst older women who are staying home to watch Kathy and Hoda drink. How about this? Red Bull. Watch. Everyone, watch. O. Henry. Twix. Not done. Potato chips. That's happy. Red Bull, O. Henry, Twix, and potato chips. So this is what's being conveyed. And God knows how much Pharrell Williams got paid for product placement there. Oops, sorry. Now let's add some stress. Everybody familiar with Cialis? Will you be ready? Let's add some more stress. It's a joke, by the way. I mean, it's true, but it's a joke. Sleep deprivation. Okay, what does that do? So the question is, has dopamine hacked our brains? And the answer is yes, it has. And they continue to increase our dopamine on purpose. So this is a company in Los Angeles that will gamify your app to make it addictive, to increase dopamine, to increase engagement. And it's called Dopamine Labs. So they know what they're doing. The neuroscientists have actually built this into these apps in order to make them addictive. So let's see where we are here now. So here in the United States, we have the 10 most obese states, perhaps not too surprising to many of you. Here are the 10 laziest states. Here are the 10 most unhappy states. Here's the diabetes rate. Here's the heart disease rate. Here's Alzheimer's disease rate. Here's the opioid use rate. And finally, here's soda per capita consumption. Now, what do you see? Correlation. Now, correlation is not causation. Could it be that there's something else that affects all of them equally? And the answer is, yeah, there could be. Poverty. Okay, so here's the poverty rate. So there's no question that all of these things do travel together. And we also talked about the fact that the non-college educated were faring much worse than the college educated and showing signs of suicide and certainly signs of opioid use. But it goes even further than that. And understanding that this is in no way, shape, or form documentation of causation. But there are some other data that, at least epiphenomena, that go along with it. So here we have sugar consumption in the United States starting in 1820, when we consumed about 4 pounds of sugar per year, moving all the way up here to 2000, where we consumed 120 pounds of sugar per year. And so here are all the different times is the growth of the sugar industry with Louisiana and Texas and Hawaii, CNH and Domino here in the mid-1800s. Here's stabilization where price equaled demand. Here's the rationing of World War II here. And here's the advent of processed food in 1965. And of course, the advent of high fructose corn syrup and the first dietary guidelines, which sent things even higher. So now I'm going to overlay on this slide the percent of GDP spent on healthcare for the same period of time. Ready? What do you see? So when processed food was introduced to the American diet, that's when GDP started going up. Spent on healthcare started going up. Remember this slide and the USA falling off? Well, here's the advent of processed food here. So I would argue that it's these 5 things here in this box that have changed our dopamine dynamics and our serotonin dynamics to promote addiction, depression, metabolic syndrome, and ultimately wastage of healthcare dollars. And that these are all inexorably linked through these 5 phenomena. Here's one of the epiphenomena, and I think this is particularly important as we approach the 2020 election. And there's data that is supportive of this. So you're all familiar with the notion that the college-educated people voted for Hillary Clinton and the high school educated and below voted for Donald Trump. And these data demonstrate that as well. So here you have the high school or GED, and here's college, and you can see on the coasts. And here's the Trump-Clinton map, okay? Now, if you take a look at Clinton supporters versus Trump supporters, there's a very distinct difference in what's going on. So here's Clinton preference versus Trump preference for fake news. And what you'll notice is that they are, versus real news, they do exactly the opposite. Okay? And the reason is because there are 2 different modes of decision making, intuitive or deliberative. You can see that here on the right. And they're overlapping, but they're clearly 2 separate peaks. So they are overlapping distributions, but it is the intuitive versus the deliberative thinking that define the Trump versus Clinton voter. The Trump voter was intuitive. Basically, the intuitive are working viscerally and not with using their prefrontal cortex to deliberate. Is there other data that supports this? Well, opioid use. So opioid use also maps onto the Trump-Clinton map. And so county by county in the United States, opioid use also correlates with Trump support and, again, intuitive thinking. So there seems to be a difference in prefrontal cortical control that leads to these changes. And we know that these various 5 things in those black boxes all eat away at prefrontal cortical control. So what I would argue to you is that some other factor are hedonics, that is dopamine, and consumerism, in particular those that generate cortisol and stress. It is the dopamine and the cortisol together that is influencing metabolic health, mental health, and our health knowledge. Now, this is not a new idea. These are new data, but these concepts have been around for a while. Aldous Huxley wrote about this in Brave New World. And Neil Postman wrote about this in his famous book in the 1980s, Amusing Ourselves to Death. What's new is that now everyone is exposed because everyone can afford the 5 things in that black box. And because of social media and because of what can happen over the internet in terms of targeting, you can now target individuals specifically. And that's why this has really grown so totally out of proportion. We've always had demagogues. We've always had dopamine. We've always had cortisol. But now everyone is exposed. So what can we do personally? Anything that we can do right now? And the answer is yes. What we need to be able to do is we need to up our serotonin, tamp down our dopamine, and lower our cortisol. And it turns out there are 4 things that will do that, and I call them the 4 C's. And they're all evidence-based, and they're all clinically proven to work, but they don't cost anything, so no refund. And they're all things your mother told you, but you have forgotten. So what are the 4 C's? First is connect. Well, we're connecting now. Unfortunately, we're connecting digitally, and digital is clearly not as good as conversation, as being able to be in the same room. And there's a reason for that. Let me give you an example of how that works. Let's take religion. There are 4,200 religions in the world. How come so many? Well, they all espouse different things slightly, but they all have one thing in common. All 4,200 religions have one thing in common, a meeting place. Because it is through social interaction that you ultimately derive contentment, peace, and happiness. It is that meeting place that matters. And of course, now we don't have a meeting place except on Zoom, which is a real problem. It is the face-to-face connection that ultimately activates serotonin. And the reason is because you have a set of neurons in the back of your head called mirror neurons that transduce the facial expressions of the person you're talking to, which then transduce those feelings into serotonin. And this phenomenon, I have a name for it, it's called empathy. And those who can't do this, who are unable to transduce facial expressions into empathy, I have a name for them. They're called psychopaths. And empathy is required for serotonin generation. The problem is social media generates dopamine and cortisol, not serotonin. And Facebook use leads to social isolation and depression. Sherry Turkle, the MIT media watcher, famously said that social media means that we're alone together. And unfortunately, our coronavirus pandemic is making that worse. Number two, second C, contribute. This does not mean to your retirement account, because padding bank account is not contributing, and lottery winners are not happy. Those who value financial success derive less contentment. Rather, saving increases happiness. Spending on yourself increases your pleasure, makes you a consumer, but spending money on others makes you an individual and increases happiness. The question everyone always asks me is, can you derive happiness from your work? And the answer is yes, only if you can see that your work helps others and your boss can see it too. Again, having to do with being outside yourself. Now, if you can't derive happiness from work, there's always altruism, volunteerism, philanthropy, anything that contributes to the greater good, because they all generate serotonin and emotional well-being. And that can be shown by experimentally by giving people tryptophan depleting drinks that will deplete serotonin, and showing the change in irritability and the change in behavior related to selflessness. Number three, cope. And with cope, I mean sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. So sleep deprivation increases the amygdala and cortisol output and inhibits prefrontal cortical function. The problem is that 35% of adults now get less than 7 hours of sleep per night, and 23% suffer from clinical insomnia. A lot of them have obstructive sleep apnea, in part because of their obesity. They take caffeine in order to stay awake, but that reduces their sleep and increases their dopamine, thereby generating even more problems with serotonin. Another problem is this thing called multitasking, which is really smoke and mirrors, because only 2.5% of the population can actually multitask. Everyone else is serially unitasking, and it drives up cortisol and also makes you lose 23 minutes of concentration as you switch from one task to the next, which only makes your cortisol even go up worse. Screens are the antithesis of sleep, especially in children. Kids who charge their cell phone in their room get 28 minutes of less sleep per night than those who charge their cell phones outside their room. And smartphone apps for wellness have not yet shown any benefit, because they're not dealing with the problems at hand. Mindfulness, on the other hand, activates the prefrontal cortex. That is what mindfulness is. It is exercising your prefrontal cortex by concentrating on one thing or even concentrating on nothing. It increases connectivity in empathy brain regions. And exercise is as good as SSRIs at alleviating depression. And if you combine mindfulness and exercise, you can actually reverse depression. And lastly, number four, cook. So we have shown that there is a phenomenon in the brain called reward eating drive. We've shown it with neuroimaging, and it can be blocked by opiate antagonists. And when that happens, the cortisol goes sky high. So these things are driving food intake, in part because of changes in metabolic status. And processed food is low tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin, low omega-3s, which are anti-inflammatory and thereby reduce serotonin, high sugar, which drive dopamine and addiction, and low fiber, which is a preventative for metabolic syndrome. The problem is 1/3 of Americans don't know how to cook. And if you don't know how to cook, you're hostage for the food industry for the rest of your life. The good news is the real food movement is in high gear, and companies are starting to change, but it's been a really, really slow process. Nestle, Unilever, Mars, and Danone have signed on to a public letter that say they are committed to change. We are waiting for that change. Hasn't happened yet. But cooking is connecting and contributing and coping and cooking all at the same time. So the single most important thing you can do for your own personal wellness is to cook a meal and sit down and eat with your family. So with that, I'm going to close the 2 books, Chance, which I wrote about diet and physical health, Hacking of the American Mind, which I wrote about diet and behavioral health, and a new book that will be coming out on processed food, which will hopefully hit the bookstores in March of next year, which will be all about processed food. Right now, the working title is Food, Pharma, Feds, Fiasco. So with that, I will close, and I thank you all for being part of this, and I'm happy to take questions, and I hope this was helpful and geared at the right level for everyone.
Thank you very much, Rob, for this very far-reaching and sometimes frightening trip through the public health, neurological, and economic dimensions of wellness and illness. Today we have 60 participants in the guest lecture, which is much more than what we typically have at the Institut d'études avancées. We have about 10 minutes for questions and reactions, and I will close the discussion at 6:20. Given the number of participants, I would like to ask everyone to keep their interventions quite short and to, of course, open your mic when you want to make an intervention. Who wants to start?
I have a question about fasting.
Sure.
If you are capable of doing it, how far out should you go? Say you're capable. Say you have the discipline to do 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 16 hours. What's the optimal length of time?
So people, we don't know the answer to that yet. Those studies are ongoing. Both Longo and several other people are, trying to figure out what is the best fasting regimen. Why does fasting work? Well, fasting works because it changes mitochondrial metabolism. It increases an enzyme called AMP kinase, which then causes cells to burn rather than store to improve metabolic health by burning off the liver fat. So this concept of intermittent fasting does make sense if you have liver fat stored up. And that's the question. Why do you have liver fat stored up? It's because you ate garbage in the first place. So if you ate real food, you wouldn't need to intermittently fast. We do know that the intermittent fasting, 18-hour intermittent fast, if you basically eat your breakfast at noon and you eat your dinner by 6 p.m. or 8 p.m., and so you have a 16-hour window, that will cause your liver fat to subside over a 10-week period. Could you get rid of it quicker by fasting for longer, say a 48-hour fast? Possibly. Again, those studies have yet to be done, and we need the intermediates, like, for instance, the liver fat, to be able to tell us that. So though I can't give you a specific amount, what I can say is that we understand the mechanisms by which intermittent fasting helps. It helps by burning off the liver fat, and it also helps by inducing autophagy, which then helps clear out dead cells and debris from cells in order to make mitochondrial work better. So intermittent fasting is a valid and rational approach to try to improve metabolic health. I don't know that it's been used specifically for mental health, although the ketogenic diet is now being looked at for mental health.
Thank you.
Next question from Ali Almasi.
Hello, Dr. Lustig.
Pleasure.
So I have a small food startup here in Pennsylvania. What do you think are my responsibilities to contribute to the real food? And I'm a big follower of yours, and I have invited a lot of people to watch at least your the truth of the sugar on YouTube.
Okay.
So what do you think are my responsibilities and how I can contribute to this? And I have a question about your thoughts about the cultured meat and future of the food.
Well, okay. Well, all right. So your responsibilities are to procure, market, and sell real food at this point. If you're processing, it's a problem because it's not just what's in the food; it's what's been done to the food that matters. I don't know exactly what you're, doing, so I can't, specifically comment. But real food works, processed food doesn't, and that's what you should remember. In terms of, what was the second part of the question?
In
The second part.
The future of food, and if I can have your thoughts on, I've been looking into, culture and meat.
Well, cultured meat.
Yeah.
So cultured meat is a potential problem, and the reason is because of the heme. So most cultured meat has heme anyway, and the heme can still be an oxidative stress. So while cultured meat may change, may have climate change benefits, it's not clear that it will have metabolic health benefits. That's not clear at all at the moment. So those studies have yet to be done.
So next on the list we had Vasilis Christofides. Vasilis, can you ask a question?
Hey, Vasilis.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for the talk. So my question is more of philosophical, let's say, the philosophical level. So how we define the happiness? I assume I perfectly understand the utilitarian notion of pleasure, okay, as you define it.
Right.
But I still have some difficulties in understanding happiness and how we actually determine the content of the deeper, let's say, satisfaction with the one self. Okay.
Sure. So, very important question is, first of all, there's happiness and then there's wellness. So let me define wellness, because that was in the title. That's one of the things I would have asked if I could, if we had, I could have told the audience at the beginning. So my definition of wellness is metabolic, mental, and financial health. If any of those are, if you're not healthy in any one of those, you cannot say that you have achieved wellness. Now, happiness has many definitions, and the reason probably is because serotonin has many functions, and there are many different receptors. There are 14 different receptors for serotonin. So different people have different definitions of happiness. What I have been using is the Aristotelian definition of eudaimonia, or emotional well-being. Now, there are people who use life satisfaction as a marker and measure of happiness. Angus Deaton and Daniel Kahneman have written about the difference between those two, emotional well-being and life satisfaction. And in fact, the data on economics and life satisfaction are clear, whereas the data on economics and emotional well-being are completely muddied. And the reason likely is because they are totally different. They are not the same. What I have been using throughout this is the effect of the serotonin on the serotonin 1A receptor, which is akin to the Aristotelian emotional well-being, or eudaimonia. So I will restrict my comments to that in terms of contentment, happiness as a manifestation of contentment. Does that help at all, Vasilis?
Yeah, thank you.
And there's a physiologic reason for doing that.
We have time for one more question. There's Mike Aguilar who wanted to make a comment or raise a question. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Your work is inspiring. Could you just touch on marijuana and how it plays into the dopamine, serotonin, pleasure, happiness dynamic?
Sure. So marijuana is binds to a receptor in the brain called the endocannabinoid receptor. And there are two. There's a CB1 and a CB2 receptor. And what marijuana does is it mimics a neurotransmitter or neuromodulator in the brain. There are two of them. One's called 2-AG and the other one's called anandamide. These are endogenous endocannabinoids. And what they are your anti-anxiety agents in your brain. And so marijuana mimics those. So it is an anti-anxiety mimic. And so if you look at the states in the United States that have legalized marijuana, and there are 7 of them, SSRI prescriptions have gone down as marijuana use has gone up. And they've gone in either direction reciprocally. So what that shows us is that people are opting to switch from a controlled medication that was prescribed by your doctor and having to be paid for by insurance to a medication that you dose yourself, that you pay for yourself, and it's over the counter. So basically what we've seen is that people have switched from one anti-anxiety agent to another. So marijuana is an anti-anxiety agent. Unfortunately, it also has some effects on food intake, especially after it's worn off. But it does not have any effects on happiness per se, because it doesn't change serotonin levels. It is interacting with that endocannabinoid receptor. So it is not a happiness-inducing agent. It is an anti-anxiety agent. And since now everyone is anxious for all sorts of reasons, including this virus, it's not surprising that marijuana is going up in terms of use.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Thanks to everyone for participating in this guest lecture. I think we're running out of time, so I will take the opportunity to remind everyone that the conference will be available online on the website of the Institute of Advanced Studies here at CY Cergy Paris Université. And I would like to thank again Rob Lustig for accepting to give this guest lecture in its new online format. So thanks a lot for joining in, and well, please connect to the website for a replay of the conference.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Arnaud, for sponsoring. Thank everyone at IAS. I missed you guys. Wish I were there.
We miss you too.
Hopefully soon.
Bye.
Yes. Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.